Helter-skelter, dictionary definition, noun, a tower-shaped structure found at a fairground with a spiral rack outside of it down which people slide on a mat. Now, according to Charles Manson, the concept was a little bit more complicated. His personal dictionary definition would have read, noun, the end of the world brought on by the Beatles. It's funny that such a silly song could become such a notorious expression. Manson's need to associate the Beatles' music with the Bible would be so distorted that it would lead to several pointless murders and scare the living hell out of everyone on the planet at some point in time. On August 8th and 9th of 1969, 7 murders were committed that became known as the Tate LaBianca murders. Stephen Parent, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Jay Sebring, Sharon Tate and her unborn child, Rosemary and Leno LaBianca, they were slaughtered by a group of kids in their 20s, hippies. Up until this time, we all knew what the bad guys looked like. They wore black and they hid out in shadows and they had shady expressions. They were predictable. Now, these murderers were kids, and these kids became known as the Manson family. Upon Charlie Manson's release from prison in 1967, he was let loose near the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, Hippie Haven. He was a singer, songwriter, not particularly good, not particularly bad, but he had a charm to him, and he began charming girls, petty thieves looking for guidance. Charlie became their guru. They brought a bus down to L.A., Deborah Harry claims she was offered a ride, and holed up in a vacated movie ranch near Simi Valley, where he tried to make it in the recording business. When this case broke in December of 1969, it became even more fascinating. More murders were discovered, murder plots, Armageddon. It involved rock stars, Hollywood royalty, and hippies. You could not make this stuff up. Michelle Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas and a friend of Sharon and Roman said that after the murders, the rich and famous in Hollywood would live, at best, in an enduring state of anxiety and at worst, in paranoia. My name is Scott Michaels. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in a corner of Detroit that was deemed the 10th most accident-prone corner in the city, so I saw fatal accidents all the time. It became part of my youth, and I think that was sort of distorted my brain a little bit. I left Detroit, spent about 9 years in Chicago, and that's when I fell in love with graveyards. And when I came to Hollywood and ran across Liberace's grave, I became hooked with celebrity death. I came out here to run a company called Graveline Tours. I wanted this job desperately, and Greg Smith, who owned the company, hired me. And after 3 years with that company, I moved to England. And that's when I started my website, findadeath.com, which chronicles the deaths of celebrities and select unusual people. And I returned to Los Angeles and started my own company called Dearly Departed Tours, Hollywood's Tragical History Tour. I think tours are as good as the guides that give them. And I would say that probably 90% of the tour guides out here want to be famous. They came out here to be actors or something like that, and thus their tour reflects their lack of interest in the subject matter. I've been on several tours. I've been on a tour where there's a guy that had Mel Gibson and Tom Cruise and Robert De Niro and Harrison Ford living next door to each other, all on the same street. And if you know where they live, you know the Mel's in Malibu, Tom Cruise is in Beverly Hills, and Robert De Niro lives in New York. They don't even have a house in LA. But people from visiting, taking these tours don't know that. And there are exceptions, but they are rare exceptions. I've always been a collector, and my collection of actual pieces of Hollywood and its buildings has grown since I've moved back. I've got all sorts of different things, and I've also become sort of a catch-all for these unusual items. People have sent me over the years, upholstery from Jayne Mansfield's car that she was killed in. I mean, it's amazing to open up my mail sometimes. So somebody recently contacted me online and found out what I did for a living. And he said, "Do you want Karen Carpenter's sink?" And without hesitating, I said, "Of course, yes, I want it, definitely." I've learned that you accept gifts immediately and then back them up with fact. This is a tile from the bathroom of the house where Bugsy Siegel was killed. This was Jayne Mansfield's heart-shaped swimming pool. The actual tile, a piece of linoleum from where Bobby was shot in the pantry at the Ambassador Hotel. It just disintegrated when it hit the ocean, and just tons of it just washed up. So these are all pieces of homes that have been demolished. Rosemary Clooney's house. This is from Mrs. Howell's house on Rodeo Drive. These are fireplace bricks from the house where Sharon Tate was murdered in 1969. Sharon Tate and 4 others. When they demolished the house in 1994, I talked to one of the demolition guys then, and they told me where they were, and I helped myself. It's history to me. And somebody's got to save it, even though I look like an idiot. Now, my obsession with the Manson murders began around the same time I moved to LA in '94, and I realized exactly how steeped in Los Angeles pop culture this case actually is. And while reading Helter Skelter again, how I realized that I was living in the set of what this crime, soap opera, horror film, where it actually took place. And that is one of the many reasons why I love Los Angeles. When Sharon Tate came to Hollywood in 1963, her father gave her just enough money to fail. He really didn't have a lot of faith in her as an actress, and as luck would have it, she did get a contract with Filmway Studios. During that time, she was put up in the studio club behind us. This is a YWCA. Former residents include Kim Novak, Marilyn Monroe, and Donna Reed. When Sharon moved in here, she supposedly had a roommate who was making passes at her, so she contacted her agent and had her roommate assignment changed to a woman named Mary Winters. I looked Mary up on the Internet Movie Database, and there's nothing except some production credits, so she probably fell off the face of the earth. The Whiskey is rich with Los Angeles history. It's probably the most famous rock and roll club in the world. The Doors were the house band. Goldie Hawn started as a go-go dancer in a bird cage hanging from the ceiling. Jimi Hendrix used to live above it. Over the years, almost everyone has played the Whiskey. Janis, The Who, The Kinks, The Stones, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen, Tom Jones, even Sonny and Cher. The Beatles never did, but all 4 of them did individually. For our purposes, it was Thanksgiving weekend 1964 that Jay Sebring and Sharon Tate met, thus beginning their year-long relationship when they were engaged. She eventually dropped Jay for Roman, but they still maintained a friendship. Now, according to the owner, Mario Magliari, Charles Manson wanted to be on stage at the Whiskey, but he was rude to one of the waitresses. Magliari demanded an apology from Manson and told him to get lost. Manson said, "I can kill you, I'm Jesus." Magliari responds, "Then I'm God, you lose," and according to him, grabbed Manson by the neck and threw him out. Contrary to urban legend, Manson was never a doorman at the Whiskey A Go-Go. Manson never auditioned to be on the Monkees. He was actually in prison when they were casting the Monkees. Also, after the murders, Sharon's father, Paul Tate, or Colonel Tate, went undercover at the Whiskey, grew his hair long, dressed like a hippie, and tried to infiltrate the hippie community to figure out what happened to his daughter, who murdered his daughter. The Whiskey was sort of the heart of the Sunset Strip. It was the focal point of the strip. Tate was a military man. He was trying to take control and figure out who did it. Also, an interesting coincidence, Tex Watson used to live about a block from the Whiskey, and Sharon actually lived behind it, right about the same time period. Jay at the time was living in a house on Easton Drive in Benedict Canyon, just about a mile from the Cielo Drive house. The last time Jay's neighbors saw him alive, he was driving his black Porsche out the driveway and down this narrow road to Benedict Canyon. This information comes directly from E.J. Fleming's book, Paul Bern, The Life and Famous Death of the MGM Director and Husband of Harlow. Paul Bern, who worked for MGM, built this house in 1930. He lived here with his wife, Jean Harlow, and this is also where Paul Bern died on September 5, 1932, under very mysterious circumstances. Officially, it's a suicide. A lot of people think it's murder. Through a terrific, fortunate series of events, I happened to have the opportunity to meet the nice people that purchased Jay's house, Jay Sebring's house on Easton Drive. And it's the nice Ron and Maggie Hale. And Ron very kindly invited us up to see the house today. Thank you very much, Ron, for joining us today.
Nice to have you here.
Now, how did you come about acquiring this beautiful home behind us?
Oh, gee, that's a long and complicated story. I'll try to keep it brief. But going back to my college days at UCLA, there were a group of us that used to go driving on Sunday afternoon, take a break from studies, and explore anything, any odd byway in the city, and encountered this house someplace along that line in the late 1950s, and I thought it was a beautiful place, and it always stuck in the back of my mind. I used to come by here once every 6 months. I'd drive by on a sunny afternoon.
Just because it caught your eye, because it was such a magnificent
I just thought it was a beautiful place.
Okay.
And I always thought, gee, I'd love to own that someday.
So you managed to get in touch with the Sebring, or it was on the market, and
yeah, it was legitimately on the market, but the Sebrings, Jay's parents, were very upset with the whole concept that their son had been murdered by a drug-using would-be rock and roll star hippie, and they wanted to make damn sure that whoever bought the house was nothing like that. Mm-hmm. And mostly they were getting offers from like rock bands that wanted to buy this as a retreat in the hills. The Doors were occupying a house just a few doors up the street.
They were on Easton, eh?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they were renting a place from Stuart Whitman. So here I was, a young, presentable doctor with a pretty blonde wife, and they liked me, and so they agreed that they would let it go for substantially less money than they were asking. The house was built during Prohibition, and it does indeed have the bookcase that swings out from the wall with the bar behind it. So the most famous story, a paranormal story about this house, or one of them anyway, Sharon Tate was, when she was engaged to Jay Sebring for about a year, she spent many nights here alone. She supposedly saw the ghost of Paul Bern scuttling around the bedroom. She went downstairs, down the staircase, and at the bottom of the stairs was an apparition of a woman with her throat cut, tied to the banister. Some people think that may have been a premonition of her own demise, which is quite just as dramatic, probably just a few years later. Have you or Maggie had seen any sort of paranormal experiences here? Never. Ron and Maggie Hale have owned the estate since 1970. The rubble of Sebring's life lay throughout. Papers and photographs of Christmas gatherings and pool parties attended by the likes of Steve McQueen lay scattered about and unclaimed in drawers. Sebring had painted walls purple, the master bedroom black, ceilings mint green, and the beautiful interior woodwork white. The plaster between the beams was covered with brightly colored wallpaper. In the 1970s, the estate became a beacon for hippies and Manson aficionados. One morning, walking to get his paper, Ron came upon a couple having sex in his car in his driveway. Above the entrance to the changing room, at the end of 4 large beams protruding from the house, are 4 visages gazing down like gargoyles. MGM writer Sam Marks remembered the faces Paul had studio craftsmen carve, represented the 4 winds, and other people identified them as everyone from Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford to John Barrymore, Valentino. Paul told intimates they were faces of 4 people who had been closest to him in life, naming 3, Barbara Lamar, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and Carrie Wilson, but never identifying the 4th, a beautiful young woman. The faces were remarkably similar to photos of Dorothy Millette. Jay Sebring was the stylist to the stars, and he was responsible for George Peppard, Steve McQueen, Frank Sinatra, and Jim Morrison's famous trademark flowing locks look.
Jay Sebring, owner of Sebring International, was the first men's hairstylist to make it big. He was the face of men's hairstylists. And he died, and Vidal Sassoon became the guy. But one of Jay Sebring's 2 salons is right across the street at 725 North Fairfax. You see where the striped awnings over there now.
The building on the left with the 6 square windows is the original building where Sebring's salon was located. Jay also cut hair for William Dozier and Adam West. Adam West, of course, Batman, and Dozier produced the show. Dozier had mentioned that they were doing a spin-off of Batman, and they were looking for someone that could do karate. While Sharon Tate and Jay were together, Sharon was working on a movie called The Wrecking Crew, and the two of them together took karate lessons from Bruce Lee. So William Dozier asks Jay, and Jay says, wow, you should meet my karate teacher. He used to do movies back in Hong Kong. His name's Bruce Lee. That's how Bruce Lee got his part as Kato, because of Jay Sebring. While under contract with Filmway Studios, Sharon was sent to London to make a movie called The Fearless Vampire Killers. Filmways hired director Roman Polanski to direct the film. She and Roman fell in love. Jay Sebring desperately wanted to marry Sharon and settle down. Sharon fell in love with Roman, who, settling down was probably the last thing he wanted to do, but she broke it off with Jay. Jay was beside himself, and he flew directly to London to propose to Sharon one last time. She refused Jay, but Jay insisted that he meet Roman Polanski, and after meeting Roman, well, Jay really liked him, and he gave Sharon and Roman his blessing. Just before Roman and Sharon were married, a bachelor party was held for him at the home of Victor Lowndes, who was the head of the British division of the Playboy Club. This home, at number 1 Connaught Square, was the most fashionable and notorious address in London in the swinging 60s. Bill Cosby, Tony Curtis, and Warren Beatty were all guests. Its decor, very Playboy, leather and walnut cocktail bar, yak fur covered walls. Have you seen my yak walls? And Lowndes' bedroom, which was fitted with electronically controlled lighting and a cinema screen. Upon their return to the USA, Sharon and Roman moved into the Chateau Marmont with their fuzzy Yorkshire Terrier named Dr. Saperstein. They lived there for about 5 months. They stayed in room 5D. From the Chateau Marmont, Sharon and Roman moved into Patty Duke and director Harry Falk's house. We're on Summit Ridge Drive now in Beverly Hills, and we're standing in front of the house that Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate shared prior to moving on to Cielo Drive. They rented this house from the actress Patty Duke, a friend of Sharon's from Valley of the Dolls. And it was while they were living in this house that they acquired the maid, Winifred Chapman. Mrs. Chapman worked for Patty Duke first, and then when Sharon heard that the house in Cielo was going to be opened up, she arranged to take over Terry Melcher's lease and move on to Cielo Drive, and they asked Mrs. Chapman to join them there. I'd met Patty Duke recently, and she told me that Sharon wanted the place. They wanted to buy the place, and Roman Polanski and her husband couldn't agree on a price, so they moved out onto Cielo Drive. Patty Duke also told me that she carried around a lot of anger and a lot of guilt about the whole situation for many, many years. But eventually, as with anything, you just have to let it go. Dennis Wilson owned Sam Cooke's red Ferrari, the same red Ferrari that Sam was driving on the night that he was killed. Dennis was a huge fan of Sam Cooke's, and he bought the Ferrari from Sam's widow. One day, while driving his red Ferrari on the Pacific Coast Highway, Dennis Wilson picked up 2 female hitchhikers, Patricia Krenwinkel and Ella Bailey, Manson girls. He took them back to his house and had sex with them. Dennis left them in his home to go to a recording session, and when he returned later in the day, the rest of the Manson family had moved in. Charles Manson introduced himself to Dennis by kissing his feet. He charmed Dennis, and Dennis was hooked. Dennis Wilson had money and musical connections. That interested Charles Manson. Manson had girls and drugs. That interested Dennis Wilson, so for a while the two hit it off. And during that time, the family stole or damaged thousands of dollars worth of Dennis's things, and Clem Grogan wrecked Dennis's Mercedes, which was uninsured.
Terry Melcher was the son of Doris Day. In fact, he wrote one of her biggest hits, Move Over Darling, for her. He also produced The Byrds and sang background on the Pet Sounds album for the Beach Boys. He lived at Cielo Drive with Candice Bergen, and he was friends with Dennis Wilson, who introduced him to Charles Manson. Charlie played for Melcher. Melcher just wasn't impressed. According to various family members, Melcher made numerous promises to Manson that he hadn't come through on. Melcher denied this. Just on the other side of this fence is the house that Dennis Wilson was living in, the former Will Rogers house that the Manson family moved into. While the Manson family lived in this house, they stole a lot of Dennis's money. They stole his car, they wrecked his car, they stole gold records, they used them for cash for future family transactions. But the house still stands here. Dennis finally kicked them out, but not before they did all that damage. And as you look over this fence in just a second, you'll see the house. It's still intact. They're working on it right now.
Dennis finally got fed up and moved in with Greg Jacobson, his songwriting partner, and his manager, Robert Levine, was left with the task of evicting Manson and his scabby clan from Dennis's house. So by the time Dennis Wilson finally got rid of Charlie Manson, the Beach Boys had recorded a song that Charles Manson had originally written and sang himself. When Charlie sang it, it was called Cease to Exist. The Beach Boys changed a couple of the lyrics around and renamed the song to Never Learn Not to Love. Never Learn Not to Love is still released, still available on their 2020 album. This is Charles Manson's version of the song Cease to Exist.
Pretty girl, pretty girl, cease to exist. Just come and say you love me. Give up your world. Come on, you can't be. I'm your kind, oh, your kind, and I can see. Walk on, I love you, pretty girl. My life is yours, yeah, you can have my world. Never had a lesson I ever learned, but I know we all get our turn. I love you, never learn not to love you.
They never gave Manson a songwriting credit on the album. They figured he already got his money when they stole that money from Dennis Wilson. So they gave the credit to Dennis Wilson, thinking he needed to recoup some of his losses. They gave Manson either A, a motorcycle to tell him to go away, or B, Brian Wilson bought the song outright. Didn't license it, just bought it straight out, gave him some money, and told him to get lost. After leaving Wilson's house, the family needed a place to stay, and Sandra Good, one of Charlie's main women, who actually once dated Stephen Kay, who was one of the prosecutors on the case, knew a guy that lived in the back house at the Spahn Ranch, an old closed-off movie ranch on San Jacinto Pass Road off the 118 freeway. Charlie returned a couple of days later and endeared himself to the owner, George Spahn, and convinced him to let he and a few friends stay. Later, Manson arrived with the typical 20 people on a bus. It was there that the Manson family sort of began its really devious turn. I'm standing right now in the exact spot where the Spahn Ranch stood in 1969. This is about where the stables were, and it was from this location that Charlie Manson sent Tex and the girls out to Terry Melcher's old house in Benedict Canyon, kill everyone in it, and make it look witchy. This is where it all happened. This is where all the planning, the Helter Skelter, the Beatles' White Album, everything happened on this land that is currently owned by the church just over there. This property also burned to the ground in 1970. Absolutely no buildings survive. As you can see, it's quite desolate out here. However, nothing's been built here since. So there are remnants of things out here. There are electrical boxes, and last time I was out here I found hinges, and we found hubcaps of stolen vehicles, no doubt stolen by the family, because they're really quite old. So a lot of original stuff still stands here, and it's wild to think no one's developed it. Everything else around this neighborhood is developed. But this is it, Spahn Ranch, right here.
Manson studied the Bible constantly and, like most people who do, used the passages to suit his needs. He especially liked the Book of Revelations, and since the White Album by the Beatles was the soundtrack of choice on the ranch, Charlie interpreted it. There's an excellent book called Revolution, The Making of the Beatles' White Album, written by my good friend, rock journalist David Quantick. Dave actually asked me to contribute the Manson chapter to the book, analyzing Manson's interpretations of the lyric or song titles on the record. Out of the smoke came locusts, insects, Beatles. Revolution number 9 sounds a lot like Revelations 9. In this song, Charlie actually thought he heard them say, "Charlie, send us a telegram." He actually did try to call the Abbey Road studios from the Spahn Ranch at one point in time. Helter Skelter in Charles Manson's mind was this crazy war that he was going to start between the blacks and the whites. Racial tension was already high in the 60s, and Manson was going to nudge this thing along. Certain passages in the Beatles album, Rocky Raccoon, Blackbird, he used them again to suit his own needs.
We have our haul includes an old Coors can, some piece of jagged something, a piece of a belt buckle, this, which I can't figure out what it is, and this hunk of muffler. So,
the belt buckle's cool.
All in all, I find this a success.
Now, another interesting point. In the Book of Revelations, their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair. Breastplates of fire, electric guitars, the Beatles. I mean, it all sounds so good, especially if you drop acid every single day of your life. Out of the mouth of 4 angels issued fire and brimstone, their music. Now, piggies were rich white people, and as the verse states, they need a damn good whacking. George Harrison was telling them to go out and kill people. Clutching their forks and knives, both of these utensils would be used as murder weapons.
Hand it down or something while I'm stationary. Oh shit, I hope this isn't poison something. Is that?
Charlie was an intelligent and convincing speaker. He used his talents to charm the damaged, often non-existent egos of his followers. This area behind the ranch, there's a creek back here, and the family would congregate by the creek listening to Charlie play music. With me is my friend Nikki Medlin. She did all the legwork, and she went around, and it took a couple of weeks, but she actually found all those locations for us. Right now we're behind the Spahn Ranch, actually below the Spahn Ranch. There's a stream that's running right here, and this cave that I'm in right now is where the very famous portrait of the family was taken. In fact, exactly where I'm sitting right now is where Squeaky and Sandy Good were crouched in the photograph. I've read about this cave for decades, and I tell you, it's really cool being here after so many years. Now, the Spahn Ranch burned to the ground on September 26, 1970. 80-mile-an-hour winds charred over 100,000 acres. As ranch hands tried to save horses, the Manson girls, their faces illuminated by fire, danced and clapped their hands, crying out happily, "Helter Skelter is coming down." Abigail Folger was the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune. She was a debutante from San Francisco. She used to volunteer at the Haight-Ashbury Clinic, the free clinic in San Francisco. I find it fascinating that it's quite likely she treated some of the people that actually had a hand in her death. In early 1969, Abigail had met Wojtek through novelist Jerzy Kosinski in New York, and together they drove to Los Angeles, moving in together on Woodstock Road. Through Wojtek, she met Sharon and Roman and Jay Sebring. Wojtek and Roman had been friends in Poland. He was married twice and had one son, Bartek. Bartek was the only one that kept the civil case alive after the trial. We're on Woodstock Road right now, and behind me is the house that was shared by Abigail Folger and Wojtek Prokowski prior to them moving on to Cielo Drive. Sharon and Roman went to England, and they asked Abigail and Wojtek to move into the house with them. So they left this house, sublet this house, and moved on to Cielo Drive. So I believe it was even the day of the murders, Wojtek returned to this house to drop off some keys for somebody. But this is the house they lived in prior to going to Cielo. Now the canyons, Laurel Canyon is where we are. These were kind of popular places for hippies, sort of just kind of wander around quite a bit. Sometimes they'd stay for a couple hours and party. Sometimes they'd stay for a couple of weeks. It was just that kind of a thing in the 60s. And they say that this house may have been one of those houses that was just sort of a party house. Now, as the crow flies, as I understand this, directly the opposite side of this house is where Mama Cass lived. And it says in the book Helter Skelter that they lived across the street from each other. Well, they couldn't possibly, because I know they didn't. This is the house and it's not the one. So Mama Cass lived, as the crow flies, in the opposite end of this property. This is the house where Mama Cass used to live, that she shared with her boyfriend, a man that she called her fiancé, Billy Doyle. Billy Doyle was a well-known drug dealer. Wojtek Prokowski and Billy Doyle hit it out quite well. John Phillips said in his book that Wojtek was a part of a bizarre crowd that was feeding off of Cass. Now, Cass knew all 4 of the 5 victims at Cielo Drive. The only one she didn't know was Stephen Parent. It is rumored that Wojtek and Billy Doyle may have been going in halves on a joint drug deal and may have burned Manson on that. Billy was one of the first suspects questioned about the murders, but was cleared. He was definitely a familiar fixture around Cielo Drive when Roman and Sharon were in London. Interestingly, the Mamas and the Papas song, Straight Shooter, the sheet music was propped up on the music holder of the baby grand piano in the living room on Cielo Drive. Now, before the murders, the Manson family used to break into people's houses. They did what was called creepy crawling, which they would break in and rearrange the furniture, or flip the painting upside down, or sometimes just petty sort of thievery, just stealing wallets and jewelry. And one of the houses that they did this to was this one right here. It belonged to a singer named Jack Jones, who is most famous for singing the Love Boat theme song. While I started researching this stuff, I got in touch with Jack Jones, and I sent him an email, and I said, well, are you indeed the Jack Jones that whose house got creepy crawled by the Manson family? He replied, yes, he was, and I asked him again, what happened exactly? How did he know it was going to be the Manson family that did it? I never got a response. A few months later, I got an email from a woman who says to me her father was sort of a celebrity in the 60s, a singer, and that their house got creepy crawled, and Tex Watson stole her father's cowboy hat. So I said, well, are you Jack Jones' daughter? And she confirmed that she was. And so I got my answer, what exactly happened? The cops came, but there was no signs of a robbery, so they took the report and left. Jack Jones spent the night and left the next day for his gig. It wasn't until years later that he found out that they were outside watching him the whole time, and that they were scared off by the police visit. Michelle Phillips claims in her book that at one point John Phillips, her husband, found 6 people dressed in black in his Rolls Royce one night. And when he found them, he yelled at them, and they tiptoed away like penguins. In July of '69, shortly before the murders on Cielo Drive, there was an apartment building here, and there was a drug deal that went wrong. A man by the name of Bernard Crow lived in an apartment building exactly where we are right now. It stood on this empty lot. In fact, Tex Watson mentions in his own book that he could see the Magic Castle, as you can see from here, out the window of Bernard Crow's apartment. Bernard Crow was supposed to be buying drugs from Tex Watson. Tex Watson took his money and went out the back door and left and ripped off Bernard Crow. Went back to the Spahn Ranch. Manson found out about it, and since Bernard Crow, his nickname was actually Lots of Papa. That's how everyone in the family knew him, and he was a black guy. And Manson was afraid that Bernard Crow was part of the Black Panthers, and he was scared. So Manson came back to this apartment that stood here and shot Bernard Crow with the very same gun that was used at Cielo Drive.
thinking that he was a Black Panther, so just to save his own ass. Bernard Crowe actually pretended to be dead because he thought Manson was so crazy he wanted them to know that he was dead, so he just laid there. But he ended up living, and he ended up still having a bullet in his body, probably still does wherever he lives. When Vincent Bugliosi, the prosecutor on the trial, found out that Crowe was shot by the same gun, he offered to have an operation, pay for the operation, and have the bullet removed from Bernard Crowe. It was a bit of a risky operation, but Bernard Crowe decided not to do it. He said, no thanks, really. But he was brought on to testify at the sentencing after they were already found guilty of murder. And Crowe passed Manson in the hallway of the Hall of Justice downtown. The first time they saw each other since Manson assumed that he killed Bernard Crowe, or Bernard Crowe looked at him and Manson looked back and said, hey, no hard feelings, man. Another interesting place just over here is Manson, when he was running hookers over to the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel a couple of blocks from here, he had a company called 3 Star Enterprises with a man named Tony Casino. And he was running hookers and topless dancers out of this building.
Gary Hinman, a friend of the Manson family, a musician, a teacher, a Buddhist, possibly a drug dealer. He either burned Bobby Beausoleil, who was an associate of the family, on a mescaline deal, or possibly came into some money that Manson wanted. Hinman was held captive in his own house and tortured for several days. At one point, Bobby apparently phoned Manson, and Manson and family member Bruce Davis showed up at Hinman's house. During the altercation, Manson famously sliced Hinman's ear with a large knife or a sword, and the girls who were there stitched it up with dental floss. Eventually, they held a pillow over Hinman's head, and Beausoleil stabbed him to death while Hinman chanted the Buddhist chant. They then wrote the words "Political Piggy" on the wall in Hinman's blood and drew a paw print to make it look like the Black Panthers had committed the murders. Bobby then took off in Hinman's car and was arrested a few days later while sleeping in the back seat. Hinman's murder weapon was found hidden in the car's wheel well, still covered in Hinman's blood. One theory suggests that one of the motives for the Tate LaBianca murders, just a couple of weeks later, may have been to create copycat crimes to make it look like Beausoleil wasn't Hinman's murderer. Like Hinman's murder, the Tate LaBianca murders would feature multiple stabbings, words, including the word pig, written on the walls in the victim's blood. Surely the cops had arrested the wrong guy for Hinman's murder.
The Manson family victims were actually autopsied in the basement of the Halls of Justice in 1969, not where we are right now. The coroner's office moved to this location in 1972. Right now we're in downtown Los Angeles, and we're here at the coroner's office to interview the coroner, Craig Harvey, who's going to help make sense of some of the technical details of these murders. And he's been kind enough to invite us in, so here we go. This is Craig Harvey, who's the Chief of Operations for the Los Angeles County Coroner. He's our expert for the victims' injuries and deciphering the coroner's report.
No, all the activity for the day shuts down around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and what's going on right now is custodial stuff. Folks that have cleaned the room up for us.
As soon as you get off the elevator, the strong smell hits you. You definitely know where you are. Chief Harvey will be giving us his expertise in deciphering these autopsy reports, which are extremely complicated to read throughout the film, describing what happened to each of the victims. Though the autopsy reports are public record, I just want to clarify that Chief Harvey did not contribute any materials to this film.
Gary Hinman was stabbed 5 times
The fatal stab wound being a stab wound to the chest. The rest of the stab wounds were in the head, in the heart, and in the thoracic area of his body, but those wounds were either not fatal or potentially fatal, but it was the stab wound to the chest that was deemed to be the fatal wound in his death. His body came to the coroner in a pretty much moderate to advanced stage of decomposition. One of the wounds that he received was to the head, what's described in the autopsy report as stab wound number 2 was a laceration or cutting wound. It happened on the left side of his face that extended from his ear to halfway between the left side of his jaw and the lateral margin of his left lip, about 5 inches in length. It partially transects the ear. The ear wound could have been fatal had there not been a stab wound to the chest.
While they were gone in London, Sharon and Roman asked Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski to move into the house on Cielo Drive just so someone would be there while they were in Europe. And Abigail and Wojciech moved out of the house on Woodstock. They sublet it and moved on to Cielo Drive. That's what put Abigail Folger and Wojciech Frykowski in the house on the night of the murders. Sharon had to return early because she was going to have a baby, and Roman stayed and he was going to return later for the birth of their son. After the murders occurred, someone asked Roman Polanski, how long were Wojciech and Abigail living in the house? His response, too long, I guess. August 8th, 1969. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Abigail Folger went into this bike shop on Santa Monica Boulevard and bought herself a yellow lightweight bicycle, arranging for it to be delivered later that afternoon. However, between 7:30 and 8 p.m., Dennis Hurst, the bike shop's owner's son, delivered it to Cielo Drive. Jay Sebring accepted the delivery. This is the El Coyote Mexican restaurant on Beverly Boulevard where Sharon Tate and friends had their last meal. According to the book Helter Skelter, they waited in the bar for about 15 or 20 minutes before they were seated. Waitress Kathy Palmer served the party, but when shown photographs of the victims later on, she could not positively identify them. I can only imagine because the name Sebring was on the reservation sheet, they know they were seated in Palmer's section. But back then she had no recollection. Nowadays, history has mysteriously changed. There are 2 tables within the restaurant that are positively identified as the one where the Sebring party ate. Sharon was in a great mood that night, very happy and pregnant. Everyone saw her and she said hello to everyone else. But back then, no one could even remember them being in the restaurant that night. From the El Coyote restaurant, the 4 went back up to Cielo Drive for the night. There was no party at the house that night, another urban legend. It was the hottest night of the year. Sharon was feeling cranky. She asked, actually, Winifred Chapman, the maid, if she wanted to stay up at the house, and Mrs. Chapman said, no, thank you. And actually, Sharon's little sister, Debbie, called up to say, can we please come up there because we need some relief from the heat? Can we please float in the pool? And Sharon's like, I just don't want company. I'm very pregnant. I'm very cranky. So there was no party. I met the guy that played Wilbur on Mr. Ed. He said he was supposed to be up at the house that night. Everyone in Hollywood wants to make the Manson murders about them. There was no party. No one was supposed to be up at the house except Robert Evans, the producer, the president of Paramount Studios, a very good friend of Roman Polanski and Sharon's. He promised Roman that he would keep an eye on Sharon and visit her daily. That night, he phoned. On March 23rd of 1969, several months before the Tate murders occurred, Charlie Manson returned to Cielo Drive looking for Terry Melcher to find out what was going on with his recording contract. He came face to face with Sharon Tate's personal photographer, a man named Hatami. He told Hatami that he was looking for Terry Melcher. Hatami told him, this is the Polanski residence. This is not the place. Maybe the people you want are back there, pointing, take the back alley. Sharon asked who it was. Sharon was on the porch, the man on the walk not more than 6 or 8 feet away, with no obstructions between them. There could be no question that Manson saw Sharon Tate and she saw him. Sharon had undoubtedly looked right into the eyes of the man who would order her death.
life at the Spahn Ranch was taking a turn. And Manson decided to fast-track Helter Skelter to start this war between the blacks and the whites. Charlie woke up the girls in the middle of the night. They thought they were just going to be going on another creepy crawl, told them to change into black clothing. He told Tex to gather the girls and take off. He told them what to do. He told them to, where the bolt cutters were, and told them how to get into Terry Melcher's old house and kill everyone in it. And also kill all of the people all the way down that road that night. They snorted speed, and just before they actually took off, Charlie stuck his head in the car and told the girls, make it look witchy. Do something witchy for them. Write things on the walls. Squish eyeballs on the walls. Behind me is Falcon Lair, which was the last home of the actor Rudolph Valentino. This was Valentino's home until he died in 1926, although he died in New York. This was his home. It's also where the tobacco heiress Doris Duke lived and died, actually, in this house under very mysterious circumstances. What I find fascinating about Falcon Lair is that it has a bird's eye view of Cielo Drive, which is just over there. At the end of that street where that house is with the domed roof, that stands at the former 10050 Cielo Drive, where Sharon Tate and the 4 others were murdered the morning of August 9th of 1969. Of those 4 houses that you see over there, the first one is authentic to 1969. The second one, that's sort of a peach or tan color, is not authentic. The third one with angled roof is, and the last one is not. So in the morning after when the bodies were discovered by the maid, Winifred Chapman, she ran out of the gates to the first house, pounding on the door, screaming, murder, bodies, blood, or something to that effect. And no one was there, so she ran to the third house, and they're the ones that phoned the police. I believe the call was logged in at about 8:35 the morning. The telephone pole is not the authentic telephone pole that Tex Watson climbed up to cut the phone lines, but it stands in the vicinity of where that one was, and also where the original gates were to the house. Now, there were several gunshots, stabs, and screams, and a lot of the person that lived in that first house thought it was just firecrackers going off, and all those canyons that you see down there, loads of people heard these gunshots and screams. The Harvard Westlake School is just down the canyon, and they had a camp out, and the girls heard the gunshots and screams, and one of the supervisors went out just to sort of scope around the neighborhood, but because these are canyons, the noises were bouncing all over the place. No one could figure out where the heck the noise came from, but a lot of people did hear it. Behind me is Cielo Drive. It's a private road. The address of the Tate Polanski house was 10050 on the night of the murders. It's since been changed to 10066. Now, on the night of the murders, Tex Watson, Linda Kasabian, Pat Krenwinkel, and Susan Atkins in their car drove up that road behind me. They went all the way to the end of it, and that's when Tex climbed up the phone pole and cut the phone lines. They coasted the car back down here and actually parked it up that street just over there and made it look like it was a residential car, it was supposed to be here. Then they went back up Cielo Drive on foot all the way to the top, scaled over the fence, and that's when all hell broke loose.
Always is always forever, 'cause one is one is one. Look inside yourself for your father. All is none, all is none, all is one. It's time to talk time from behind you. The illusion has been just a dream. The valley of death and I'll find you. Now is when on the sunshine beam. So bring only your perfection, for their love will surely be. No cold, pain, fear, or hunger. You can't see, you can't see, you can't see.
It's Cielo Drive, and it's the 8th of August. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk up that street up to the houses just a couple of doors in front of the actual murder location, where a friend of mine lives, and he has very kindly invited us in. So that's our invitation to get up the road. So let's head up. We're doing this on August 8th, which is the exact anniversary of the murders at the exact time when the murders happened.
And by the way, this is exactly what the killers did. They parked their cars back there and they went back up here on foot.
It's eerie to walk in the footsteps and see exactly what they would have seen walking up this very hill, minus, of course, a few motion detectors. These houses on our left as we're going in, these would have been the houses that the maid Winifred Chapman ran screaming towards us to these houses, screaming murder, bodies, blood. Actually, the house closest to Sharon and Roman's house, Mr. and Mrs. Seymour Cott, they had gone to bed that night. They had just said goodbye to some guests about midnight, so it was a very small window of time that Tex and the girls went in there. Mrs. Cott heard, in close sequence, 3 or 4 gunshots, and she just went, wonder what that was, and went back to bed. I've done this several times, walk up to these gates at this time, and sometimes there are some really disconcerting surprises. I've seen people kind of hiding in the bushes up here, like 3 and 4 people, really quite frightening people, just kind of waiting for us to leave so they could pay their private visit. Sometimes there are flowers left up here around that time.
So this is a spot where all the crazy shit went down 38 years ago tonight. These are the gates to the new estate, renumbered 10066. The original telephone pole stood pretty much where that one is today. The gates were a little bit further back, and it was right just after midnight that Stephen Parent was killed right in front of us. And all the other crazy stuff happened just around the corner. Right here, right here. It's so quiet up here.
This next footage you're going to see is the interiors of the house where the murders occurred, taken while Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails was renting the house to record the album Downward Spiral, shortly before the house was demolished in 1993. Trent also took the front door with him when he left, the door that had the word pig written on it in blood. William Garrettson was hired by Rudolph Altobelli to care for the house while he was gone. He was caring for the dogs in the guest house where he lived, and he took care of all the lawn duties. That night, he actually hitchhiked down to the Sunset Strip and bought some cigarettes and beer and came back up to the house on Cielo Drive. About 11:45 that night, an acquaintance of his named Stephen Parent had driven up to the house and offered to sell Garrettson a clock radio. While he was in the guest house with Garrettson, they plugged the radio in, set the time, which is how the police figured out what time about the murder occurred, and they had a beer. And during that time, Stephen Parent made one phone call to somebody that lived in the vicinity of Santa Monica Boulevard in Doheny, and that is where Stephen Parent was headed to when he left. Garrettson didn't want the clock radio. Stephen Parent took the clock radio with him and took off. Had he left 2 minutes earlier, he probably would have made it out the gate, but he didn't. And he came face to face with Tex Watson, who held his hand up as he was pointing up to the gate and said, "Halt." And that's when it ended for Stephen Parent.
Stephen Parent was shot multiple times with a small caliber handgun. His ultimate cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds. He also suffered an incised wound on his left hand that was so deep it went to the bone, and at the same time cut his wristwatch completely off of his hand. It is believed to be that it was a defense wound. He put his hand up to ward off an attack. In addition to all of that, his toxicology screen was fairly unremarkable. He had a very small amount of alcohol in his system, 0.02%. He just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Interesting to note that as you look through a lot of the documentation on the Sharon Tate murders and everybody who lost their lives that night, a lot of the documentation lists Stephen Parent and only Stephen Parent. It's believed that the reason that is because he was the first victim encountered by law enforcement, so he became the anchor case, if you will, to this multiple murder investigation.
Tex then removed the side screen window and crawled into the dining room. And he walked to the front door to let the girls in. He noticed that Wojtek Frykowski was laying on the sofa. He kicked Wojtek, and Wojtek said something like, "Who the hell are you?" And Tex replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's work." Probably one of the most famous lines in this entire debacle. He sent Susan Atkins back to the house to see who else was in it. She walked past Abigail Folger's bedroom, who was reading a book. She smiled and waved at Abigail. Abigail smiled and waved back. Then she walked back and found Sharon and Jay in the back room. Sharon laying on the bed, Jay Sebring sitting on the edge of the bed, just talking. So she came back into the main room, told Tex Watson what was going on. Tex said, "Go get the others," with a knife, and she brought them all back in. Tex told Susan Atkins to tie Wojtek Frykowski up with a towel, and she did the best she could do. They tied a rope around Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring's neck. When Jay Sebring objected to this, saying something like, "Can't you see she's pregnant?" Tex responded by shooting Jay. And when Jay fell to the ground, Tex began kicking him and stabbing him and stabbing him.
Jay Sebring had 7 stab wounds and a gunshot wound. 3 of the stab wounds were possibly fatal. Final cause of death was exsanguination due to the multiple stab wounds, but the gunshot wound, there was an exit wound. The bullet had penetrated the body, but did not penetrate through the shirt, so the bullet was trapped in between the surface of the skin and the shirts. They were able to collect that important piece of evidence. His toxicology exam was also negative. There were no drugs found. In addition to the stab wounds and the gunshot wound, Mr. Sebring appears to have also been physically assaulted as well, possibly as a result of repeated blows, possibly by kicking. A lot of what appears to be blunt force trauma to the face, contusions found in the nose, left upper and lower eyelids, in the lip area. There's a lot of swelling caused by repeated application of blunt force against the facial structure, breakage of the capillaries underneath the skin. Because of the tissue reaction, the swelling, etc., that was going on from the repeated applications of blunt force trauma, we know that the injuries were inflicted ante-mortem, in that they were done while Mr. Sebring was still alive.
When Sebring got shot, that's when all hell broke loose in the house. Wojtek Frykowski got loose and ran out the front door, and Tex tackled him and stabbed him and shot him. Abigail Folger ran out the side door. Pat Krenwinkel chased her and tackled her, maybe about 30 or 40 feet away from Wojtek Frykowski. They just went out different exits of the house. Pat recalls Abigail saying, "I'm already dead."
Wojtek Frykowski has the dubious distinction of being the victim who probably was the focus of the most injuries in the attacks at the Tate Polansky estate. Suffered a total of 51 stab wounds, 2 gunshot wounds, and 13 lacerations. He also suffered a significant amount of battering blunt force trauma by his attackers. His final cause of death was multiple stab wounds of the body causing massive hemorrhaging. The opinion of the medical examiner, the gunshot wound by itself would have been a fatal wound. And the second gunshot wound was a through and through. Mr. Frykowski's toxicology exam was fairly unremarkable. He did have a small percentage of the MDA, the methylene dioxyamphetamine, like Miss Folger had on board as well, but certainly not a significant amount. Abigail Folger was stabbed 21 times in the face, the ear, the neck, the chest, the abdomen, the back, the right arm, the left arm, the hand. A lot of stab wounds, a lot of ferocity in her attack by virtue of the number of stab wounds and the placement of stab wounds, and that they're all over, as if there might have been a struggle. She might have fought her attackers in some way. Her final cause of death was the stab wound of the aorta. Certainly multiple stab and defense wounds contributed to that, but the stab wound of the aorta was the fatal injury. Her toxicology screen was fairly clear, although it did come up with a small percentage of MDA, methylene dioxyamphetamine.
Sharon was the last to die. She was alive inside the house, sitting at the edge of the sofa, begging for her baby's life. She said, "Take me with you, let me have my baby, then kill me." Susan Atkins then looked at her and said, "Look, bitch, I have no mercy for you." Sharon was actually stabbed 16 times. Atkins had entertained the thought of removing the child from Sharon's womb and presenting it to Charlie as a gift. Had she done that, the baby may have survived. It was fully developed. The fact remains she did not, and Sharon died still carrying her child.
Sharon Tate was stabbed a total of 16 times, 4 times in the chest, once in the abdomen, 8 times in the back, once in the upper right arm, once in the upper left arm, and once in the right thigh. 3 of those stab wounds are considered fatal stab wounds. In addition, her toxicology screen was completely clear. There were no drugs on board. There was no indication of sexual assault either. Her fetus was found intact. It was not removed from the body. The fetus was examined at autopsy and was found to be a pretty much full-term pregnancy at about 1,500 grams, and examination revealed a normal male fetus. The size and the gestation of the fetus would indicate that had medical attention been rendered soon enough, it would have been possible that the fetus probably could have survived outside of the womb.
After they left the house and they were heading back towards the driveway, Tex told Susan to go back in and leave some writing on the wall. Susan went back in the room alone, picked up a beige face towel with the label Luxor by Martex on it, and wrote the word pig in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door. There are certain theories of the bodies being moved. There's something that's called a blood map, where they found Sharon's blood and Jay's blood on the outside on the front porch. There is a theory that Manson returned to the house and they moved the bodies. They were going to string Sharon Tate up on the front porch. Whether that happened or not, I can't really say, because there's no proof of that except for this blood. There are people that claim that they'd heard voices up at that house about 4 a.m, men arguing. The fact remains that Tex and the girls left probably between 12:30 and 12:45 a.m., and that's officially the story. After they left Cielo Drive, they drove north on Benedict Canyon Drive and stopped off this street to hose off in a random driveway. This would have been about 1 o'clock in the morning. They drove the 59 Ford Fairlane up the street and turned it around and pulled back down towards Benedict Canyon. They got out, turned on the garden hose at Rudolph Weber's house. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Weber heard noises, and Mr. Weber came out to see the hippies hosing off in his driveway. He said something like, "What are you kids up to?" And Tex replied, "Sorry, we didn't mean to wake you. We just stopped to get a drink of water. We were walking through the canyon." Mr. Weber spotted their car and asked if it was theirs. Tex replied, "I just told you. We were walking through the canyon. We're sorry we disturbed you." Weber said, "That's your car, get in it and get the hell out of here." Mrs. Weber was screaming for her husband to get the license plate number. So Tex and the girls pile in the car, but Tex had trouble starting it. Weber actually reached in to grab the keys, not realizing what these creatures had just done up the road. Fortunately for Weber, Tex got the car started, put it in gear, and drove off up the canyon. Weber did write down the license plate and description of the car, and that proved to be very useful for the prosecution. After they ditched their clothes, Tex told Linda Kasabian to wipe the fingerprints off of the gun and throw it out the window of the car. As they were coming over the canyon,
they decided to throw the gun outside the window of their car into a wooded area, what they thought was a wooded area. They didn't realize it was actually somebody's backyard. So they threw the gun somewhere probably within the last 20 yards behind me, and they sort of threw it over this way, and it landed in the backyard of this little house just over here on our right.
The gun actually landed behind this house, the house that belonged to Bernard Weiss. Weiss had a son named Stephen, and the gun was found on September 1st, 1969. Bernard Weiss, Stephen's father, called the Los Angeles Police Department, and they agreed that it sounded like the gun that was used in the Tate case, and they'd get back to him. Nobody did. He got home later in the evening, reread the Atkins story in the LA Times, and was convinced he had the right gun, and called the police again. After being told the gun was probably destroyed, he called a friend who was in the media. The friend got in touch with the prosecution went to the police department, got the gun, and they had their murder weapon. After ditching the gun, Tex and the girls stopped off at a gas station on their way back to the freeway. They wanted to make sure they got rid of all the blood on their bodies and clothes. Geographically, the gas station they would have stopped in would be this one, on the corner of Ventura Boulevard and Beverly Glen. This is the road that Benedict Canyon turns into, so they absolutely had to pass it. This is another degree of separation that I choose to believe. It is a fact that this is the gas station where James Dean stopped the morning of his death, September 30th, 1955, when he filled his little silver Porsche up for the very last time. There is an iconic photograph of James Dean standing in front of these very gas pumps. This is the bus stop that Winifred Chapman was dropped off at every morning. On the morning of the murder, she got off here and began her walk up to the house. Eventually, a friend of hers recognized her and gave her a lift straight up to the gates at Cielo Drive, and it was her that had the dubious task of actually discovering the bodies. As news of the murders began to leak out, William Tennant, Roman Polanski's business partner, was sent to the house by Sharon's family for confirmation. He left tennis practice and arrived at Cielo Drive still in his tennis clothes. After confirming that Sharon and her friends were dead, Tennant called Roman at his flat in London, the same flat that Roman and Sharon had shared on their honeymoon. It's located at 95 West Eaton Place Mews in a very nice section of London. William Tennant broke the news to Roman Polanski. Roman returned to America immediately. This is Abbey Road in London, where the Beatles recorded their music. John Lennon once said, "I don't know what Helter Skelter got to do with knifing anybody." At 11:35 a.m. London time, on the 8th of August, the very same day the Tate murders occurred, photographer Ian McMillan balanced himself and his camera on a stepladder in the middle of Abbey Road. He took 6 photographs walking back and forth. This is the one that was chosen. Roman Polanski returned to America and was immediately put up at Paramount Studios by his friend Robert Evans. Roman was being put up to keep him away from the press in a dressing room that had recently been vacated by Julie Andrews. There was a notice published in the Los Angeles Times that Roman Polanski and friends were offering a $25,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of people responsible for the deaths of Sharon Tate, her unborn baby, and their friends at Cielo Drive. The LaBiancas weren't even included in this at the time. Little Stephen Weiss actually split that reward. Rosemary LaBianca used to be a car hop at the Los Feliz Derby in the late 40s. The Los Feliz Derby, now called Luisa's Trattoria, is one of 5 original Brown Derby restaurants, the only one that still exists. And this is where Rosemary met her first husband, Frank Struthers. Later, while waitressing at the Los Feliz Inn, now called the Tam O'Shanter, she met Lino and they fell in love. The Derby also has a bar behind it, which was also featured in the movie Swingers, and also where Dolly Parton, Jane Fonda, and Lily Tomlin get really hammered in 9 to 5. This is the Gateway Supermarket at 2619 Figueroa, where Lino LaBianca worked. He was the manager of the Gateway Supermarkets, and this is the main one he worked in. Rosemary LaBianca, who had the Boutique Carriage, a shop which was at 2629 Figueroa, which is where that Mexican restaurant is right there. That was the address of her little dress shop. Rosemary was worth a lot of money when she died. She invested wisely. She spent most of her life as a waitress, but invested in stocks and was worth actually more than Abigail Folger when she was killed. Rosemary and Lino LaBianca went to Lake Isabella to pick up their son Frank, who had been vacationing there for a week, and returned late on Saturday night with their daughter Susan. They dropped off Susan, their daughter, here in this building behind me, where she lived with her boyfriend, Joe Dorgan. You may recognize it. This is the building from Melrose Place. The exterior is from the TV show Melrose Place, but this is where Susan lived with Joe Dorgan. Joe Dorgan, a shady character. Some people think that he actually was a member of the family for a while, which makes sense then if you think about Susan coming out later on and testifying for Tex Watson's release. There are some stories, one in particular on a website called charliemanson.com, which claims that Tex Watson lived just down the road over there for a period of time. It's endlessly fascinating, and there are many, many facets to this. We'll never really know the truth, but this is for sure where Susan lived. Later, Susan, Joe Dorgan, and Susan's brother Frank would discover the bodies. The LaBiancas stopped at a gas station where John Focchianos operated a newsstand. John was the last person to ever see the LaBiancas alive, aside from their murderers. Going to the newsstand, they bought a newspaper, and because it was actually the Sunday edition, there was a special pull-out section on the Tate murders. John Focchianos gave it to Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca comped. More than likely the entire way home, since Mrs. LaBianca was so shaken up by the news, they were probably discussing it as they were driving to their own deaths. On the second night of murders, Charlie and the family were looking for more people to kill. They drove to Pasadena. They were looking in people's windows. They saw pictures of kids. They didn't want to kill them because they like kids. They were debating whether to shoot people in cars next to them at traffic lights. It was going to be very random. They were in this neighborhood, and Charlie Manson remembered being in the house behind this one. It was rented by a man named Harold True, and Manson and the family partied there several times. So on the night of the murders, Charlie came up to True's house because he knew it, but he didn't want to go to the house that could be traced back to him, so he went one house over. And that's why he chose this house, the home of Rosemary and Lino LaBianca. And this is where the LaBianca slayings happened early in the morning of August 10th, 1969. While the entire city of Los Angeles could have been watching For Whom the Bell Tolls on television, that's when Manson entered the house and the murders of the LaBiancas occurred. Charles Manson and Tex Watson went in the back door of the house first and tied up Mr. and Mrs. LaBianca with leather laces that Charlie had around his neck and promised them no harm would come to them. Then Charlie left without leaving any fingerprints. The girls went in next, and they are the ones that did the dirty work. They took Rosemary LaBianca into the bedroom. Lino LaBianca stayed in the front room, in the living room, and that's when it all happened.
Lino LaBianca was stabbed 13 times, had the word war carved in his abdominal area, and then was stabbed or punctured 7 times with a fork, which was found in the abdomen, but the depth wasn't that great. In fact, it's described as being only superficially inserted in the abdomen, so in order to prevent it from falling out during transport, it was removed at the scene. The final cause of death for Lino LaBianca was multiple stab wounds to the neck and abdomen, causing massive hemorrhage, and the stab wounds included transection of the right carotid artery, laceration of the trachea, perforation of small bowel and colon, and perforation of the mesentery. He also had indications that there were ligatures around his wrist, so that he was bound at one point during the attack in his home. He had absolutely no defense wounds, so he probably felt that if it was just like a home invasion robbery, they were just going to be able to tie him up, take what they wanted, and leave, and then they probably started the butchering. Rosemary LaBianca was stabbed 41 times. The ultimate cause of death for her was multiple stab wounds to the neck and trunk, causing massive hemorrhage. Multiple stab wounds of the back and trunk are present, 22 of the upper portion of the back, 14 on the lower portion. The stab wounds to the neck and trunk causing perforation of the lung, perforation of the stomach, laceration of the spleen, and one of the more important injuries, the laceration of the cervical spinal cord, which would have rendered her pretty much helpless and would have had an immediate impact on her ability to sustain life, because that's electrical conduit that keeps the body functioning, and once that's lacerated or severed, then there's a serious interruption in how things function in the human body. She was discovered dressed in a house coat type affair and had a pillowcase over her head with a electric cord ligature around her neck.
Now, aesthetically, the house has changed considerably. They built a parking structure on the right, they've widened the driveway quite a bit, but the house itself and the driveway on the left look pretty much the way it did in 1969. According to at least one published report, Walt Disney lived in this house, but that's turned out to be an urban legend, but not without base. Leno was actually born in the house, but the truth is that Rosemary and Leno bought a house in Los Feliz once owned by Disney, but sold it before moving back to Waverly Drive in 1968. After the murders, the killers took showers, they ate watermelon, and left the rinds in the sink to make it appear like black people did the murders. They wrote a couple of words in blood, helter-skelter on the fridge, misspelled. Leslie actually changed out of her bloody clothes into some of Rosemary LaBianca's clothes. They sat in the bushes behind me, ate chocolate milk and cheese, and then waited till the sun started coming up, and they hitchhiked back to the Spahn Ranch. According to Tex Watson, and after they left the house, they wandered around the neighborhood for a while. He tossed the bayonet that he used as the murder weapon into the Rowena Reservoir as far as he possibly could. Venice Beach was like sort of the Haight-Ashbury of Los Angeles, except for Sunset Strip. A lot of hippies, a lot of homeless people hung out and still do. That's how Charles Manson met Squeaky Fromm, Lynette Fromm, one of his most ardent followers. When he first met her, according to legend, he said to her, "I am the god of fuck." In early August of 1969, Sandra Good and Linda Kasabian were hitchhiking and were picked up by a movie actor named Saladin Nadir. Mr. Nadir had starred in a Lebanese movie called Broken Wings. Sandy and Linda went to Nadir's apartment at 1101 Ocean Front in Santa Monica. He lived in Unit 501. He had sex with Linda, but not with Sandy because she was pregnant. Early on the morning of August 10th, while Tex and the girls were killing the LaBiancas, Linda, Manson, Sadie, and Clem would return to this place to try to kill Nadir. Linda, frightened and feeling guilty, took them to 403 instead to spare Nadir's life. Lucky for the guy in 403, they didn't kill him when he answered the door. The party left, but not before the lovely Susan Atkins took a shit in the stairway.
After leaving Venice Beach, Manson and the others drove to Sylmar. And they had Linda Kasabian wipe off all the fingerprints off of the wallet and leave it in a gas station in Sylmar, because he thought that Sylmar had black people living there, and he thought that certainly a black person would pick up the wallet and go, I'm going to use these credit cards, and start the war between the blacks and the whites. It turns out that the wallet was never even discovered until December of that year, and by then it was so dilapidated from the moisture in the toilet that it was pretty much useless. Next to the gas station where they put the wallet is a Denny's, and Charlie went into Denny's and bought milkshakes for everyone in the car, like a good dad, and off they went to the Spahn Ranch. When Frank returned from Lake Isabella the next day about 8 o'clock, he noticed that all the windows had their shades pulled down, and the boat was still attached to Leno's car that was parked in front of the house, which was really unusual because Leno was very good about putting the boat away properly. He got nervous about going in the house, so actually what he did was he walked down to the intersection of Hyperion and Rowena, where there was a burger joint called the Char Burger. He called his sister's work, asked for Susan. Susan wasn't working, but the manager took the number of the payphone, called Susan at her apartment with Joe Dorgan, and Susan and Joe came and picked up Frank, and together they went to the house and found the bodies. When the bodies were discovered by Frank and Susan's boyfriend Joe Dorgan, they ran screaming down this driveway to the apartment building just over here and begged the people to make the phone call for them to call the police. The first call was made by the first woman who lived here saying she's got crazy kids outside screaming. So they went to the next door, and she's the one that invited the kids in, hysterical, and she's the one that called the police, and that's when this thing broke. Behind me is John Marshall High School, which is used in lots of films and TV shows because there aren't any palm trees. We could be anywhere in the country. Specifically, the athletic field behind me was used in the film Grease. They filmed the finale behind me, and in the finale, they had an amusement park set up here, and you see an M on the side of that building. They actually had a banner over that M that said Rydell High on it. For our purposes, Frank Struther, Rosemary LaBianca's 15-year-old son, attended John Marshall High School in 1969 when he had the misfortune of finding his parents murdered in their home. Various other people attended Marshall High, including Julie Newmar, Judge Lance Ito, Leonardo DiCaprio, a couple of the members of the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Michelle Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. She was friends with Sharon Tate, and she had an affair with Roman Polanski. When John Phillips, Michelle's husband, found out about it, he threatened Roman's life. When Roman found out about the murders, one of the first suspects in his mind was John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas. Roman broke into John's house, stealing his address book to see if the handwriting in the address book matched the letters P.I.G. written on the door in Sharon's blood. Eventually, after an altercation with John Phillips, Roman seemed convinced that John had no part in the murders. Shorty Shea was killed probably around August 25th or 26th of 69, a little less than 3 weeks after the Tate LaBianca murders. He had worked as a horse wrangler on the Spahn Ranch for about 15 years. He was married to a black topless dancer named Magdalena, and Charlie didn't like blacks. But also because Squeaky was assigned to George Spahn, when Shorty was trying to get Manson kicked off the ranch, Squeaky told Manson, and a plan was taken into action. There is one theory that Shorty had overheard talk of the murders. Interesting fact, the next of kin listed on the autopsy report for Shorty is his wife Magdalena. Just for shits and giggles, my buddy Scott Grohl called the number recently, and it turned out to be the state penitentiary in Kentucky. We're in the vicinity of the Spahn Ranch now on Old Santa Susana Pass Road. And behind me is a location where the ranch hand, Shorty Shea, was found dead. Now, according to his autopsy report, Shorty's body was found a half-mile north at Topanga Canyon Boulevard, which is just a half-mile to our right, and approximately 250 feet down the embankment off of Santa Susana Pass Road, which is where we are. So Shorty's body was found between the spot where we are right now and those train tracks right there, but 250 feet straight down. It's a gully between the tracks and the road where we are right now, so it's quite treacherous. We're not going to even attempt it. And actually, I got kicked out the last time I was there. But this is where Shorty's body was found. Now, what they found was his skull was lying free from the rest of his skeleton. He was wearing pants and a shirt. His left hand and half of his left humerus were missing, actually. It appears the animals made off with the missing parts. But this is quite treacherous, actually, and they dug him up and took him down to the coroner's office downtown in Los Angeles, where he was autopsied.
The remains of Donald Jerome Shea, or as he was also known as Shorty Shea, were discovered on December 15th, 1977, and the remains were skeletal. Pretty much the majority of his skeletal remains were recovered. There was hand missing, but for the most part, the remains were recovered in toto. We were able to discern a cause of death, even though the remains were skeletonized. Final cause of death was listed as multiple stab and chop wounds to the body. In the back of the head, there appear to be approximately 5 to 6 wounds at the rear of the skull, and the injuries appear to be consistent with a tool that could be an axe or some other linear device. Skeletal remains of the person are going to retain that data even though the flesh is long gone. In this case here, it's clear there's some sort of an axe or other type device used to cause his death by virtue of the application of this tool to the bone structure in his skull.
When things started heating up at the ranch, Charlie loaded up the bus and they moved to Death Valley to the Barker Ranch. This was my second trip up to the Barker Ranch, and I will never go again. I said that I wouldn't go back again after the first time, but I will definitely not go after this time. The salt flat there on the right is the one that Tex Watson would later get stuck in when he escaped in his truck. You may have seen the little ghost town of Ballarat in the opening scene of the film Easy Rider. Information from DesertUSA.com. Ballarat is located at the base of the Panamint Mountains, established in 1896 as a supply point for the mines in the canyons of the Panamints. In its heyday, from 1897 to 1905, Ballarat was the home and headquarters for 400 to 500 people. It hosted 7 saloons, 3 hotels, a Wells Fargo station, post office, school, jail, and morgue, but not one church. The town began its decline when the Ratcliffe Mine in Pleasant Canyon east of town suspended operation. The town now has only 2 full-time residents. The store here is open daily, and the gentlemen there were extremely forthcoming and friendly. According to my buddy Greg King, who is a Manson murder historian, the truck that's in front of the store at Ballarat is registered to Bobby Beausoleil's wife. As they were approaching this place, that's when Manson back at the ranch realized that they were gone. So Manson hightailed it down here just to meet them here. But there were witnesses here, so Manson had to go, "Oh, I just wanted to give you some money so you wouldn't leave without any money because I felt sorry for you," but actually he was probably going to kill him. There's this empty building over here that has the words Helter Skelter carved into it. This is all very Deliverance out here. It's very it's fascinating. But the gentlemen have been nothing but kind to us.
We're sitting in the middle of a fucking death trap.
Between the snakes and the place falling down. And those guys. Is Helter?
I don't see the H, I see T-E-R.
Yeah, Helter Skelter. Yeah.
From here, you go even farther into the middle of nowhere, about 20 more miles of rugged terrain. This sign says Guller Wash, which is the actual literal wash when there's flash floods where water will come down, and where the Barker Ranch is located in the Guller Wash. Barker Ranch is in the middle of nowhere. If you don't have a 4-wheel drive vehicle, forget it. You're not getting anywhere near it. Amazingly, I had my little GPS bitch in the box thing, and she actually picked up the Guller Wash, which really surprised me. On the way to the Barker Ranch is the Newman Cabin. The Newman Cabin is located at the base of the Newman Mine.
There is a fucking thing of human remains. This envelope contains the human cremated remains of Ernest Leroy Hill.
The cabin actually has become a place where hikers sort of hang out and they stay the night there and they sign the guest book inside of it.
Right, I'm gonna autograph the book. See the 30th.
The original Manson family bus was destroyed. After the trials, a woman named Stella, who owned the property up over the top of the mountain behind the Barker Ranch, hired some local miners to cut the bus up to pieces. I heard that the bus was actually, the family bus was taken and towed down this way and chopped up into pieces. We're still in Guller Wash on the way back down towards Ballarat. And I was told that the bus was brought down, chopped up into pieces and left here. And then eventually it was sort of floods have covered it up. Now there's some remnants of something, which could be it, which I was told was directly across from the mine shaft, which is right over there. So it's quite possible that this is actually the family bus that we're passing right now. If I don't get bit by a snake. But I can't find any recognizable pieces of anything. That thing I pulled out of the dirt over there may have looked like sort of like a seat, but I don't know, those are put there. That's very Blair Witch. I don't like that one bit. The hell put them there and why? Our next stop is Barker Ranch. This is the good book. This is what we are doing, and this is why we are here. Because where this story ends is in that house right there. Where Charles Manson and the family breathed their last free air was in that building right there. And I hope to God no one's in there.
Now, the Barker Ranch was owned by Mrs. Arlene Barker. Manson paid her a visit and asked if they could camp there. She assumed it would only be a few days, and Manson paid her with gold records from the Beach Boys, claiming to be their composer and arranger. People still stay at this ranch, and that's why it's always frightening to come up here, because you don't know what the hell's inside these doors, or who.
Look, there it is right there. That's the spot. Underneath that window. I'll show you, actually. Where Charlie Manson, when they raided the ranch, when the cops raided this ranch, they sort of gathered everybody up, and Charlie was nowhere to be seen. And the cop entered this room, and you could still see the outline of the little sort of cabinet that was here. That was right here. And Charlie was actually in that cabinet here, and the policeman saw his hair sticking out of a crack, and he thought it was maybe a mop or something. They opened it up, and sure as anything, it was Charlie. So that's how they got arrested. So Charlie's last minute as a free man was spent right in this little airspace. It was nuts. To whom it may concern, this place looks great. Nice clean up. The chairs came in handy too. Visitors of Barker Ranch, please don't litter or steal this book. I made it because it's important to me and it says more. I made it. Charlie, Charlie, Charlie. Look at this, ATWA. This is Manson. Air, trees, water, animals, all the way, always. That's Manson. All the way alive. Okay, sorry. There's the map. All is love, all is love. This is Manson stuff. Okay, let's see what's in the fridge. We should write Helter Skelter on it, but misspell it. Where's the path? Look at bullet holes.
This photograph is what the ranch looked like when the family lived there. It looks pretty much the same, except the bus is gone.
According to the Nelson book, this is clearly the swimming pool. And Tex Watson claimed that he swam in this pool. Obviously, a lot of them did before they were arrested. Not much else to do out here. Just can't imagine having that kind of running water out here, you know? It's just, we're in the middle of nowhere.
We are now on a search for Tex Watson's truck, as photographed in the book The Family by Ed Sanders. We've heard it somewhere behind the ranch.
Is that the truck?
It's green.
That's what I said. But why would they drive all the way back here? That doesn't make sense.
Nope, it really doesn't. There's the lettering.
What's it say?
Helter Skelter.
Oh, geez.
That's the one. That is the one. So we've managed to debunk a myth. I'm going to open up this door is openable. Fuck knows what's in there. shit. Epilogue. In May 2009, the Barker Ranch in Death Valley mysteriously burned, reduced to walls and rubble. It's unlikely it was arson, but probably just somebody being careless with a fire. There is a rumor that a barbecue was found inside the home and melted camping gear in the vicinity. This is a building that I swore I'd never visit again, but I think it's extremely sad that others won't be able to visit it now. Like it or not, the Tate LaBianca Manson story, this is our history too. It may not be a high point, but it deserves acknowledgement and preservation just the same. There is talk of the ranch being rebuilt. I hope this happens.
Sing along with dirty old halls, family game, pretending for fame, hide